Hello, everyone. I'm Shamsi Iqbal. I'm a principal researcher in the Productivity and Intelligence Group in Microsoft Research Redmond. And it's my pleasure to join you all to talk a little bit about some work that we have done in the space of productivity, and especially thinking about productivity in this new mode of work that even a year ago, we didn't quite imagine that our work life was going to go through such a big transformation. So I'm going to start off with acknowledging this amazing team of people that I have had the privilege of working with. And so the top two rows are my colleagues at Microsoft, as well as my academic colleagues. And the bottom two rows are the amazing interns that we get to work with every summer. And so these interns come for 3 months, they work on a project with us, they bring their own expertise, their own insights, and many of the work that I'm going to talk about today is going to be work that the interns helped us with. So I'm going to start off with the motivation of this work. So we all know that user attention is fragmented, but also the traditional way that we think about how we can get work done is that we set aside time where we can focus, we can nail things down, we can kind of like get things going, and that's how we are productive. But also there are many sources of stimuli that are pulling human attention in different directions. And part of the attention fragmentation comes from the fact that human beings are natural multitaskers. We want to and tend to do multiple things at the same time. And oftentimes we overestimate our ability to multitask effectively. And contrary to what we might believe for ourselves, we face challenges in protecting our attention and directing our attention to the right thing at the right moment. And so what means that when we have attention fragmentation, that means that we have like many of these small moments during the day where we feel are wasted time. So of course, no talk on productivity in these unusual times would be incomplete if we don't talk about what the new normal is. Most people now are working at home amidst other distractions. There are other people at home who may not share the same kind of context of your current levels of engagement. And those people or those entities don't interrupt you at the opportune moments that we expect that happen at work. So when you're at work, someone, if they want to interrupt you, they would take into account whether you're in a meeting, whether you are engaged, and then they would come and talk to you. But at home, things happen. You have to switch your attention back and forth. So we did a survey earlier this year when the pandemic started, so a couple of months into the survey. And so one of the things that came out of that survey, we wanted to see how people were managing work during the pandemic. And so one of the things that came out is that everyone is interleaving personal or family responsibilities with work. And this is no surprise to most of us that when we are transplanting our work environment into our home environment, that basically means that we are interleaving our lives. And we especially found that people who have caregiving responsibilities, they're suffering the most. What is happening is that people's home related activities are sipping into work time, and their work related activities are extending into their family time, including weekends. The other thing that is also very clear is that how we had envisioned the future of work has fundamentally changed over the past few months. And this is due to a big transformation that is happening in how we work, because now we are getting used to the idea that we can actually work from home and get things done. Of course, I've talked about only the challenges so far, but there's also some benefits. And earlier, before this talk, I was just talking with Ujal and Jay and Siang about how there are some benefits of working from home. And so what we see is that organizations are thinking about this pretty extensively, and the data from Global Workplace Analytics suggests that 20 to 30% of the workforce will be working from home multiple days a week by the end of 2021. And now whether or not that's something that's going to extend indefinitely, that's something still to be seen, but it seems that people now believe that this is possible. So if past work on highlighting the importance of well-being in the context of work was a prudent consideration, in the not so far future of hybrid work, this balance becomes a key factor in upholding long-term resilience so that we can easily adapt to changes no matter what comes our way. And so that's why I would like to kind of like position our future of work statement from this point of view, is that we would like to design for not only productivity, but also building long-term resilience. I like to think of this as in two dimensions, not necessarily orthogonal, but I mean, this is how it is. So in one dimension, there is the productivity. And so there are certain research areas that have a lower emphasis on the productivity part and then the higher emphasis. And then there's also the resilience. And so when I say higher emphasis, it means that there's a specific focus on that particular dimension. Um, so uh, Primarily, so whenever we looked at multitasking work, the early research was mostly around how we are having difficulties in engaging in tasks and how our productivity is being impacted. And this is because inopportune notifications, our difficulties in balancing our attention across different types of activities when we are doing things that don't have any beneficial outcomes in terms of productivity. And some example of those work earlier, many years ago, when I was an intern with Eric Horowitz, we did some work where we wanted to explore how people got affected by notifications and what happened after that. And so one of the things that we found is that people, once they would see a notification for an email or a chat message, they would go and attend to those, and then they would go off on a chain of diversion. So once they saw one email, they would go and check other emails, and they would go and open up a browser. They would then go down that rabbit hole of different types of explorations. And it took them about upwards of 25 minutes to get back to where they were before getting interrupted. We also looked at the effects of notification on focus work and what happens if you stop the notifications entirely. And we found that notifications are not always bad. So if you don't have notifications, sometimes people feel that they are not having that cue that can help them get to important information, while others were just more able to focus. So it's kind of like it goes both ways. Um, I'm not going to talk about the driving work, but we did some extensive work around driving and attention management. And the primary goal there was to see what happens when people are trying to do other things when they're driving. And I'm not necessarily talking about, I mean, dangerous things like you're trying to actually type a text message, but it's mostly about getting engaged in conversations while you're in driving, and just like hands-free kind of multitasking. And so we found that the complexity of multitasking obviously negatively impacts driving, but there might be some careful interleaving that is possible. And we know that because we already do some of that when we're driving. We interact with the in-vehicle systems, and we talk to people in the car. So some of that is already happening. And the question is, how can we make sure that we are doing all of these things in a safe way? So moving into the next quadrant, where there was a bigger focus on the productivity aspect and thinking about how we can help people get things done, not only in kind of like the standard way of helping people focus by protecting all other distractions, but also other ways of getting things done. Primarily work has looked at how we can understand focus and how we can design for focus. And so some work that I did with Gloria Mark and Mary Sherensky in 2014, we found that people's focus peaks in mid-morning. So they don't come to work and start focusing and getting things right away. They kind of like have to ramp up to work. And typically it's around into an hour after they come at work. That's when they start getting things done in a focused manner. And it's also in mid-afternoon, right after lunch. Interestingly, we found that rote work, where people are doing kind of like boring, repetitive kind of work, leads to most happiness, which is almost counterintuitive. And focused work, not necessarily flow, comes with some stress because you're feeling challenges. Oftentimes things don't work the way that you're expecting. And so these things we did through some kind of physiological measuring, where we were kind of like measuring stress as well as logging data as people were going about their day-to-day life. This led to us contributing to Focus Assist, which is a Windows experience where you can actually block notifications and other kinds of distractions for a period of time so that you are able to focus, and it holds back the notifications, and it presents them to you as soon as your focus time ends, and the vision is that only the important notifications, so from your boss or from your teammates, those would be allowed to come through. We also looked at how we can help interruptions to be managed, to happen at opportune moments, and then consider cognitive load when you are allowing another task to be interleaved. And then the last point, which I'm going to kind of like actually talk about a bit more, is that in complementary to focus work, can we use the little bursts of moment that exist throughout our day to do something productive? And that is the whole topic of micro productivity. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I mean by micro productivity and micro tasks in general. So the notion of microtask, they have their root in psychology literature, and the definition that I like to use comes from Knudsen and Enquist. So microtasks are basically perceptual units of behavior. So if you take a complex task and you start breaking it down, not so much that it goes to kind of like the very action level, but a little beyond that, something that you can do in a few seconds and without a lot of requirement for context. And so an example is that what I have on the right side, you take writing a paper, which is a huge task, you break it down into multiple, still big enough subtasks, and you keep on breaking them down. And then at some point it can become as small as insert a citation, fix the spellings, fix a paragraph, fix the flow, and so on and so forth. So micro productivity is basically the transformation of these large productivity tasks into a smaller set of subtasks. And it isn't as simple as I described, obviously, because once you start breaking down tasks and you start doing them in using micro moments, then there's of course the challenge of putting them all together and making sure that the work you have done, it kind of like it fits and it is actually contributing towards the larger task. So we all are actually doing microtasking in today's world. And I mean, we do things like email, we do communications, we do social media, we do to-do lists, we do browsing. But we haven't necessarily, or we don't necessarily feel comfortable doing more complex tasks. So for example, writing a paper or creating a PowerPoint presentation, and God forbid, if you want to do coding. So we don't think of these tasks being compatible with micro moments. We always think that for doing these things, we want to be able to set aside time to focus. And so that is kind of like where we wanted to take that challenge, is that can we take one of these complex tasks, break it down into component subtasks, and then start doing some of those subtasks, not all of it, during micro moments. So in the next few slides, I'm just going to talk briefly about some projects that we did that use these micro moments to get some parts of a complex task done. So the first project was called Playwright. And so this was basically a project where you could take a complex writing task. So basically Playwright was an entire framework that would analyze your Word documents. It would create micro tasks out of the Word documents. It would upload it to the cloud, and then you could see those micro tasks on your mobile device. And we designed the mobile experience in a way that the tasks would show up as things that you could do in a few seconds. And they were kind of like, we were using Angry Bird as an inspiration then. And so we had things like, okay, so let's do as many tasks that you could do in 2 minutes or 3 minutes, or let's finish all tasks in a particular category. Let's see how fast you can do those. So we wanted to create this kind of game-like experience for work, so that people did not necessarily feel that they were doing work when they were interacting with these micro tasks. And we envisioned that this would be used when people were waiting in line, maybe getting coffee, maybe waiting for a meeting to start. And instead of perhaps playing games, this game-like environment would give them some progress in tasks that were actually important to them. And I'm not sure that people can see this very well, but in the bottom 4 screenshots, it basically shows what the tasks look like. And these are kind of like very small snippets of the text that we show there. So we don't show the entire document, we just show as much as context we believe that is required that is needed for that task. So examples of tasks were fixing the grammar of a particular sentence, or fixing the spelling, picking the right spelling from a list, accepting or rejecting changes in Word documents, or triaging comments. So do you want to follow up on this comment later? Do you want to delete this comment? Do you want to respond to this comment? And again, just the text that were associated with that particular task would be shown. These were all curated for the first part. But one of the feedback when we did the study is that people thought that this was great, they would use it, but they wanted to create their own microtasks. They didn't necessarily feel that all the microtasks that were shown by the system would be particularly valuable for them in real life. So this led to our next project, which was attempting to answer two questions related to the playwright work. So one is that what happens if we let people decide on their own microtasks? And the second one was that what happens when people are completing these microtasks, and then the results from the microtask comes back into the document, and what is the document quality after that? So this was work that we did last, not this summer, but the summer before. And so we basically re-implemented the playwright system in a slightly different way, so that it didn't necessarily have to analyze the Word document data. We let people signal in their Word document which things that they are going to create as microtasks. And the system would go through, and then it would automatically extract text that would correspond to that microtask and show it on their mobile device. And then later they could go around, once when they were up and about, they would complete those microtasks, and those microtasks, same way, similar to Playwright, they would be integrated back into the document. So the study that we did there, it looked at, well, it was a kind of a mixed study, in the sense that we told people the type of document that they had to write. And so people would come into the lab, they would spend about 10 minutes creating an outline of a document on a particular topic. And I am drawing a blank on what that topic was, but I believe it was around, oh yeah, now I remember. It was a topic, the topic was that describe a city that you are familiar with, where you're creating this tour guide so that other people would come and want to visit that city. And we asked people to indicate what the microtasks they would like to do in that document. And so we had them work in a situation where they didn't have access to the internet. And so if they needed any information, citations, they could create microtasks. But if they wanted to also, they wanted to kind of like modify the text later, they could do that as well. So, and then for the next stage, for a couple of, I think it was 3 days in between. And so people had access to all of their microtasks over the app that we created, the mobile app that we created. And also for a control group, they had access to the entire document using mobile Word. And we wanted to see, compare the experiences of the two groups. And after 3 days, both groups came back to the lab. They integrated the changes back in the document. And then we asked them to kind of like spend 10 more minutes finishing up the document. And we then compared the length of the document to prior to the mobile interaction, and kind of like we looked at the changes. And what we found is that people who are using the mobile microtasking system, they had more edits that they did compared to the Word people. And mostly the microtasks that people were creating, they were about inserting information. There were some rare cases where people said that I need to kind of like fix this flow or change these paragraph sequences. That is not something necessarily that was very well supported in the micro writing system, but it was mostly in inserting information, or maybe just like correcting the grammar of things and small things like that. We also asked people when they were doing these types of microtasks in a follow-up survey, and people said that it was mostly during the commute time, especially those who were on public transportation or were being in a car where they were not driving. But it was also between meetings and when they had like these little moments. And this was mostly the mobile micro editing system people. So this kind of like, and I mentioned this before, but at the end, we found that the mobile editing system people had more, their documents were longer. They had more edits to do once they came back, where the mobile Word people had generally less edits once they came back into the lab. So this kind of like gives an idea of what happens. So if you are doing tasks via microtasks, there people are making progress and they feel comfortable because these are like very small chunks of things that they're doing and they don't need to get engaged in an entire document. So that was beneficial for them. So we also wanted to kind of like take this idea of microtasking and see that, well, I mean, given that these tasks are so short and can be done in very short moments, can we actually start thinking about, well, is there a casual way of doing these microtasking? And we wanted to take a leaf out of the distraction literature where people get distracted when they're working because they see something coming from a non-work related activity or app or a website. But if you flip it and say that, well, when I'm on a non-work related activity, can I distract people back to work by showing them these little snippets of work? So we used Facebook as our kind of test bed, and we inserted microtasks related to people's Word documents that they were working on into their Facebook feed. And we wanted to see whether one is that how people would engage and whether these would serve as a subtle reminder to return to work. And we thought that, well, this might also be a lightweight way of engaging with activities that are typically backgrounded. And but on the flip side, we also wanted to see how people felt about us inserting work into something that is clearly that people do for relaxation. And so what we found was interesting. People mostly ignored the microtasks as they ignore many other distractions in their Facebook feeds. But that would happen for typically the first 2.5 minutes. And then if they're still on Facebook, they would start getting engaged in one or two of these microtasks. And you can see an example in the screenshot. It's just a fixed spelling. And this was coming from the Playwright engine that I talked about before. So people would get engaged in one or two of these, and then they would go back to their Facebook browsing and then would come back. And what we found is that for 20% of these interactions, people would actually go back and open up the actual Word document from which these tasks were coming. So in our mind, that seemed to be a good metric of success, is that for some cases, people were able to kind of like ramp up to getting back to work on that document. But in the feedback, what people said is that they felt that if the microtasks that were coming, if they came from a document that they hadn't touched in a while, that would be more interesting to them than actually work that is coming from a document that they're currently working on. Because in many cases, you are on Facebook because you want to be away from that document. You don't want that work following you into your relaxation time. But they were completely open to the idea that if there's something that I haven't interacted with a while, this is a way for me to keep that context fresh. So the next project that I wanted to talk about, moving away from writing. So we had done quite a few years of work looking at writing and microtasking. And so in 2018, Alex Williams, our intern, so he wanted to look at what we could do in microtask programming. And can we actually think about doing programming via microtasks? As I said, programming, as we all know, is a very focused activities. We did an initial contextual inquiry where basically Alex followed around a bunch of software developers and he wanted to kind of like understand their work patterns and also do some kind of like questioning as they were engaging in their work. And so, I mean, and this is something that we all probably know, is that programming is something that is seen as very focused and people want to set aside like large chunks of time so that they can get their things done. And one of the things that was also interesting is that programmers, especially at the end of the day, they would stop themselves from getting engaged in something new towards the end of the day because they knew that they couldn't leave it once they started to interact with it. Or once they would engage with it, it would take them like 2 or 3 hours before they left. And so it's kind of like there was this like way of working which was very chunked into big chunks of time. So we wanted to explore what kind of activities that are related to programming could be done outside of the IDE on a mobile device away from the computer. And if you think of it, people are already doing some of these things. So people look up references. I think that's the biggest one that we heard from our participants, as well as a survey that we did, a larger scale survey that we did with software developers, is that the most common things that they do is looking up references and reading all these programming related sites. And they typically they use email as a vehicle to send information back and forth. We had asked people on the survey as to what are some of the things that they would like to do, and the two key things that came back were people wanted to do some kind of unit testing maybe, and people wanted to have an easier way of browsing for related information and then sending that information back so that that information is in their IDE. So and this works. So basically, Alex created this engine that again analyzed people's Visual Studio Code information. It would create two types of microtasks. One was corresponding to unit test. The other one was looking at the doc strings, and it would do a search, and then it would show the relevant the relevant references on a mobile device, and that looked. It's not clear entirely in this middle part, but that is what the mobile interface looks like. And so it shows in one half, it shows the code part, and then it would show something on the right that would say that, well, what is the unit test that you want to run here? And then is this code working properly? And so you could do these things in very short moments. And then the results would get integrated back into their IDE once they return. So we did a kind of like first user study where we gave people a code base to work with, and then for half an hour, and then they would go off for a half an hour. No, I think it was 15 minutes with their mobile device, and they would have access to some of the micro tasks that the engine had created for them. And then they would come back and work on the code again for 15 minutes. Again, I think we got good reception, is that people thought that having some of these microtasks on a mobile device made them feel that they were not entirely wasting their time when they went to get coffee, or they could keep on working in some bits and pieces without totally disengaging from work. And more importantly, it helped them keep the context alive as they were up and about. And once they came back, the results being integrated meant that integrated in the IDE meant that they didn't have to go to different sources to grab the information that they had produced during their mobile interaction with the tools. So one thing that is important and I want to bring it up here because it's going to be related to the next section, is that dealing with micro moments is always there's a balance. So you don't want to fill your day with work, making use of every single free moment that you have. And that is not the intention here either. I think that one of the things that our goal was to see is that, well, if we can leverage the many micro moments that exist during the day and provide people a viable way of getting some work done, it might actually add more flexibility and act as a complement to our focus work. And it might help us actually get work done without having to set aside focus time. And maybe in that way, if you defrag all of these micro moments, maybe you can end up saving an hour at the end of the day. And I think that this, especially during the pandemic, I think that this has become more and more important as our lives become more interleaved. I'm going to move on to the next section. So if you look at the top left quadrant, which is kind of like where the focus was necessarily not so much on the productivity, but thinking about breaks and physical and mental well-being. So that's where I think that there's a nice synergy between the micro productivity work, also thinking about people's physical mental well-being, because in the first glance, it might seem that those two things are at they're at conflict with each other. And I'll talk a little about why that may not necessarily be the case. So, so one of the projects that we did here is that we wanted to kind of like help people. And this was work that we did in 2017. And interestingly, it has become so relevant now. And that was, again, one of the projects of Alex Williams. And what we wanted to see is that how can we help people easily transition between their work life and their personal life? And the big challenge there is that because, again, our lives or still back then even, was interleaved. And so when you come to work, you're often thinking about your home responsibilities. When you go home, you're still thinking about your work responsibilities. And you're never really disengaged from anything. And we looked at occupational health psychology and organizational behavior, and we found lots of evidence that suggests that adequately disengaging at the end of the day and then re-engaging at the beginning of the workday is actually helpful for long-term productivity. And so we wanted to create this experience looking at conversational agents, is that can we help people disengage at the end of the day and then re-engage at the beginning of the day? So when they're at home, they're fully present at home and not necessarily thinking about work. I know that this is not true for everyone and this is not practical for everyone, but we were thinking about the general population who are having difficulties in maintaining the boundaries between work and life when those boundaries need to be maintained. So we created this conversational agent that would interact with people or people would interact with it at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, which maps nicely to the commute time. Though the study we did wasn't necessarily during the commute time. It was right when people were leaving work. So when they were walking to their car or walking to the bus, and right before they entered the office. And the interaction was super simple. It was based on cognitive behavioral therapy, and it was just basically 2 questions. And we tried out 2 different approaches. One was a more task-centric approach, where the agent would ask people, what did you do today? That was part of the disengagement protocol. And it would ask, so basically asking people to reflect on what they had done for the day. And then the second question is that what do you want to do tomorrow? And let's create kind of like a list of things that you want to come back to when you start your day tomorrow. So that was a task-centric approach. And then the other one was the more emotion-centric, reflection-centric approach, where we asked, or the agent asked people, how did you feel about today? And coming at that question from a reflection point of view allowed people to actually not only think about work, but think about how their work made them feel. And that way they were actually tackling 2 things at the same time. And we also asked them how they wanted to feel about work the next day. And so this was the disengagement part. When they came back the next day, the task-centric agent would ask them this is what would tell them that based on our interactions yesterday, these are the things that you said that we wanted to do. Do you still want to do them? And what is the first step? So not making it overly complex or overwhelming, it would ask people to think about what the first step would be in doing that task. The emotion-centric was similar, asked people how they wanted to feel, reflecting back what they had said the day before, and asked them what was the first step to feel that way. And sometimes it would be just, I want to start off with having a cup of coffee. But in a study, what we found is that people they found these interactions to be quite valuable. Productivity increased about 12 to 15% in a week's use, according to people's self-reported perceptions. 60% of the people felt that their productivity had increased. But more importantly, I think that what people had reported is that they felt that they were more engaged. And for the emotion-centric one, people had reported more sustained productivity throughout the day. The people who are in the task-centric group, they reported that they felt more productive the first hour because they had very specifics about how what they needed to do to start their day. And on the other hand, on the other side, we found through indirect measures that people were sending less work-related emails after work hours. We didn't necessarily ask people, or we measured people's productivity or any other kinds of metrics when they were at home, because we didn't want to confound or we didn't want to ask people productivity related questions so that then they start getting engaged at work again. So we were looking at indirect measures at that point. And if we would extend the study, we would probably look at more indirect, maybe physiological measures to see whether people were stressed or less stressed. This work, interestingly, it came back this year as a recent feature that has been announced as a virtual commute, where now Microsoft Teams is putting time on people's calendars at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, protecting that time, allowing people to kind of like reflect on their day and plan for the day. And so that time is protected. They start the day with making this mental transition between work and home, which is super important now because we are really not commuting anywhere. But that exercise of transitioning has proven to be important. So there was also some work that we did looking at what happens when you block distraction. And so this was again in the pre-COVID era, and we were interested to see what is the value of breaks, sorry, not blocks, but breaks, and especially digital breaks or physical breaks, but more importantly, all the interactions that you might have with social media and what happens to your productivity and what happens to your stress and other kinds of metrics. So we did a 32-person in situ study where in the baseline week, we just collected people's perceptions around their productivity and stress and workload and as well as individual traits. And then in the experimental week, what we did is that we used the Freedom software to restrict access to any non-work related site that the users defined that were distracting to them. What we found was that when you block these kinds of distractions, people have higher perceived productivity. So they feel that they are more productive, they're able to focus more, they have less temporal dissociation, which means that they felt that time was passing slower. They also reported that they had lower enjoyment in work. But what we found was interesting is that there were also some interesting personality traits here, which were impacting some of the findings. So we found that people who were generally more susceptible to distractions, once you take away their distractions, they're able to improve their control over work when things are blocked. And by this, I mean that they were basically able to focus more on work. And people who are less susceptible to distractions and who are more conscientious in the Big Five personality scale, they reported that they were getting more done, but they were also very stressed. And part of the reasoning was that these people were already pretty organized in the sense that they would schedule their own breaks and they would only stick to those kinds of breaks. And once you take away those breaks, it makes them incredibly difficult to actually relax and let go of things. So that again, it highlights the importance of inserting breaks into your kind of like day-to-day activities. I think that part of this work was influenced by the fact that organizations tend to block these non-work related sites. But what our research found is that for kind of like just relaxation and reduction of stress, sometimes some kind of controlled diet of non-work related activities at work is important. What we did find though is that since we had stopped the digital breaks, people were taking more walks and they were kind of like just moving away from their computer. So which is actually a good outcome. So the last quadrant, and which is where we would like to be, is that we want to be not only designing for better productivity, but we also want to design for long-term resilience. And this is where the importance of designing for productivity balance with people's well-being needs becomes important. And I think as a productivity company, we have developed a lot of tools that help people get work done, get focused, get work done in different ways. Our mobile tools are also growing. But there has been a less focus of actually integrating well-being needs within these productivity experiences. There again, on the side, there are a lot of tools that help us with our well-being. There are apps like Headspace and other types of meditation apps. There are apps that help people with their physical activities, but these are not necessarily connected and integrated with each other. So the renewed focus right now, thinking about the future of work, is that how can we balance productivity and well-being? Like I mentioned this survey at the beginning, where we were looking at how people were adapting to the remote work. And this was a survey with external professionals. And what it showed that people are exhausted. Stress is higher, work and personal life is increasingly interleaved. We also did a log analysis of Teams data and Office 365 data, and it showed that people are multitasking more during meetings. And this paper just got accepted to CHI. What we found is that during Teams meetings with longer meetings and larger meetings, people tend to multitask more, which is probably not surprising because people have to find time to do their own work. And if the days are filled with meetings, it's very difficult to find time to do your own work. We also see that there's an increased use of task management tools, but it also has to adapt to hybrid work scenarios. So for example, if my life is now interleave, I have to manage my kids' work as well as my own work, and how do we create these tools that allows me to seamlessly transition out of focused work and kind of like these non-focused work scenarios. And then also, again, how can we build tools that can help people design their day so that they can incorporate specifically their productivity and well-being needs? I talked a little about the virtual commute feature that is blocking time, but we also did some work looking at how we can add other types of time on people's calendars so that that can be used for well-being needs. So the last project that I'm going to talk about is that how can we take into account emotional well-being in our efforts of being productive. And so this was work that we did with Harman Kaur in 2018. She did 3 internships at Microsoft. So this was the second internship that she did with us, our group. And it was a 2-step investigation. And so the goal was that as people are being productive or doing work, there are often times that they're actually not being productive or not being effective. They get stuck in work and maybe not making progress. And this is a time when maybe they need to transition out of that particular work stream and either take a break or focus on something else. And so this is what we wanted to do, is that can we build models that can understand, that can kind of like model this activity or model the situation where people are getting stuck. What are some of these signals that that indicate that people are getting stuck and they should be transitioning to something else or should be taking break? So we used 2 different sources of information. One was people's log data at kind of like a very high level, in the sense that it would look at keyboard and mouse activities, but it wouldn't look at what people were typing, and it would look at what applications people had open without too much too much details about what they were doing in that application. And then there was also another part that was looking at people's facial expressions via a tool that we had built internally and that facial expression would indicate whether people were feeling stressed, or they were feeling happy, or they were feeling nervous, and all of those things. So it was able to distinguish about 8 kinds of different emotions. And we wanted to build predictive models that eventually could recommend actions, either transition to a different task, continue with what you were doing, and take a break. So the first step was building these predictive models. And so we had recruited 25 people. We collected 3 weeks worth of data. And this kind of like highlights the type of data that we're collecting. We're collecting emotion data via a webcam, just looking at people's emotions and kind of like recording at a very high level what kind of emotion was being collected, was being emoted at that moment. We had some heart rate data that was also, again, recorded based on the change of people's change of color on their face. We were looking at physical movement, distance from the screen, and eye movement. We had the interaction data, time and day, and task information in terms of whether people were typing, they were reading, and they also completed a task list at the beginning of the day where they could indicate that this is an urgent task, this would take X amount of time to complete, or I have done X amount of this work, and so on and so forth. We also collected data on whether people had transitioned, or they were transitioning to a certain thing, they were taking a break, which was basically something that was not work related, or they were continuing. And this was basically, the output was an expected value that was calculated as a cumulative sum of task progress effect and productivity given stress, and the outcome for each of the actions. So whether people should continue, whether people should transition, and they should break, and the action that had the highest expected value would be recommended to the user. So what we found is that the model for each person, the model yielded about 2 or 3 predictive features, but the computational cost was large. So we initially started off with building classical time series models, and it was large. It was taking about 15 minutes to process. So we switched to random forest regression models, which were far quicker and showed mostly the same kind of features for people. So what was interesting is that different people showed different predictive features, which is not necessarily surprising, but there was also some things that we could see based on job roles. And so this is kind of the cluster models that you can see in the figure. So for example, software engineers, for them, task information and interaction data seem to be most predictive for the whereas for the cluster for financial managers, the time of day seemed to be the most predictive, crucial feature. But again, it wasn't true for necessarily every individual in that group. So basically this means, and we know this, is that instead of a generalized model, having a personalized model is better. So we wanted to see how this model could be used to predict people's actions, could help with these recommendations in real time. And so because it was towards the end of the internship, we just did a very short deployment just to get a sense of whether or not the models were able to pick out the right moments to suggest a transition or a break. And so the participants would get this interface periodically to indicate whether this was a good moment for a recommended action. And they could say that, yes, this is it. If it says that, well, this is a moment for you to take a break, they could indicate, yes, this is, which is basically a positive label. It could say that, well, no, this is wrong. This means that we made a mistake. And we wanted to just analyze that data to see how the model was performing. So what we found is that for the transition recommendations, and this is where people would transition to a different task, not the one that they were focusing on. So there was about an 86% accuracy. And for the break recommendations, where the system told people that you should just go and take a break now and not work at all, that was about 77%. And I linked the paper. It has far more detail than I had talked about. But I mean, the core takeaways from this work is that, well, if you jointly optimize task, activity, and emotion, you can have more effective recommendations for tasks and breaks. So people are not always rational in the way that they do tasks or they take breaks. And so sometimes taking into account people's emotions can help with that. Intelligent assistants can help, can use these types of models at a personal level. So I think that we need to be very careful about how these models are being used. And so we emphasize the fact that these models should be running locally, and whatever recommendations or whatever analysis it does, it should be all done on the machine that the user is using, and not necessarily send things up to the cloud. And then, I mean, one key question is that if we are continuing kind of like to build these models, so now that we're working from home, how do these model performances change? And my suspicion is that it probably changes a lot. So just to summarize, because there was quite a bit there and it was kind of like touching quite a few directions. I mean, I wanted to kind of like highlight a few takeaways. So first of all, I mean, one is that productivity, as we found, and as we were trying to kind of build this new mode of productivity. You can be productive not only through focused work, but also in short bursts and also across a wide ecosystem of devices. Again, the desktop device is our main mode of getting work done, but there are also, if you can design the task properly and you can design the experience properly, you can also get a lot of things done on a mobile device, taking into account the limited attention and the limited screen real estate. We also know that reflection and mindfulness are important, and especially in these days, as we are kind of like having difficulties in balancing our work needs and our personal life needs. We also know that physical and digital breaks are important during the workday, even more so now as we tend to just be in one position and not move. We don't have those natural ways at work that we had that were all naturally interleaving or inserting these opportunities for physical and mental breaks at work. We don't typically have those. And I think that one of the things that we are hoping, and we are hoping, and at least the evidence suggests that if you can balance productivity and well-being at work, that will help with longer-term resilience. And I think that the different companies who are developing these productivity tools really need to take this into account seriously. So I wanted to kind of like end with a set of open questions for the future of work. I think one of the things is that how can we support efficient work for people who are working in hybrid settings? And I talk about hybrid settings because at least in the near future, this is probably what we are looking at. And that part is going to be more complex than just remote work, where everyone is working from home remotely and everyone is kind of like they have the same kind of setup. And when I say setup, meaning that every single person is working from their home, or I mean, in most cases, but in a hybrid work situation, a proportion of the people will be working from work. And how do you kind of like balance that with people who are working from home? And obviously their situation is going to be very different than those who are working at work. And I think that, I mean, for success in hybrid work, one of the things that is going to be important is that seamless transition between devices and attentional constraints. And even as an individual, as you transition between working at work and working at home, how can you make those transitions feel seamless and there are no frictions? And I think that this is good. Something that is going to be really important is going to be at the organizational level or at the institution level, is that what are some of the adaptations that are needed to support better hybrid work? I think that there's a strong need for the organizational culture to change. And I think that there needs to be investment in developing tools that support more democratized remote participations. And so just because someone is working from a different location, they should not have to suffer because the tools are not allowing for their own constraints that they have at home. And I think that there are also a lot of like policies that need to change, and those policies need to also inform the tool design. So on that note, I'm going to kind of like end here and maybe leave this slide up there. And I would love to open up the floor for questions. I know that I went long, but I think that we probably have time for some questions.
Thanks a lot, Shamsi. That was wonderful and packed with a lot of useful insights. I'm sure all of us really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. We do have a handful of questions that have trickled through into our chat, and I'm going to ask the participants to kindly unmute themselves and ask these questions if you'd like to. Susan, would you like to go first?
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. It was indeed packed with information. I had a bunch of questions around the microtasking. So given the time constraint, I'll just ask all of them and you can cherry pick which answers you think are most interesting to answer. So I started writing these when you started to talk about the playwright experiment, because I was wondering, so first question was, how did people feel about filling those small amounts of time with work rather than taking the small breaks? Like, isn't it sometimes beneficial to actually have a small break rather than being super productive, which sort of links to your later topic on taking breaks? So how did the microtasking take breaks into account? Were the tasks small and clear enough that it didn't take too much mental effort to switch just even for those 2 minutes? Because I can imagine it's still cognitive load if you do different things, even if it's very clear cut. And I even had a third one. Yes, I can also imagine that for some tasks, it's actually quite hard to chop them up into smaller tasks. So for what type of tasks does that work or not work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'll try to give a high-level answer that addresses all three of those. So I think that I'll start off with the part of, should we fill up all our moments with work? And answer is a resounding no, we should not. And we also saw that in our studies that people were not necessarily working all the time. So they would pick their moments. And so, for example, for a long commute, they would not necessarily even do the work all throughout that commute. They would maybe do one or two tasks. It kept them engaged, and they would switch to something else, and they would just do their other stuff. So that's one thing that we found. And we specifically asked this question because this is something that we were concerned about, is that once you give people the tools to work more, they might actually continue to work more, and we don't want necessarily that to happen. Yeah. The other one about what are some of the tasks, and so whether people had the right context. So what we found, and especially in the playwright one, because these tasks were curated in the sense that it was predefined. And some tasks people just ignored that. Well, I don't have any context, I'm not going to do it. When people specified their tasks themselves in the next project that I had described, so they were very conscious about the fact that they would be doing these tasks when mobile, and they knew that they wouldn't have a lot of context. So they only specified tasks that they knew that they could do with little context. So it could be something like, I need to insert this citation, and as long as I know where to look for it, I can easily do this. Or I need to fix this sentence, or so things like that, that really did not require them to access the document. We did give them access to the document to see whether, for what task people needed to go back to the document to get the context. And we found that people did this probably, only 2 people did it once each, and that's it. So I think that was that. And the third question was about what tasks can be microtask, and not everything can be, obviously. And I think that the way that we look at microtask is as a complement to focused work. And again, there are things that I know that I want to be able to focus, and I don't want to get distracted because I want to go and find the citation, and I know I can do that later. Can I defer that so that I can focus on my work now? But I'm not going to really defer, say, reorganize this document, or even that's not something that you can even microtask. So I would say that there are certain parts of a larger task that can be maybe microtasked. We saw that in the programming example as well, that obviously most of the things cannot be microtasked, that there might be some things that you can pull out. So that's kind of like the way that we're looking at it now.
Yeah, but that makes sense. As a complement to focused work, then I can totally imagine that it's added value. Yeah. Great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Great questions.
Can we have Manasa up next?
Hi, thank you for a great talk. I had a question about managing micro-productivity in jobs that are not necessarily completely on a computer, like jobs that involve, say, lab work or interacting with other people. Do you think we can design tools that can help productivity as well as well-being in these kind of scenarios?
I think so. I think that, one of the biggest challenges with kind of like micro productivity work is understanding how you create these workflows. And if you have a good sense of, well, we looked at specific domains like writing and programming that is all happening on a digital device. But if you're able to create a workflow for anything outside of that, and then, we do this, or at least I try to do this a lot, is that I have a paper notebook beside me, and I just write down like small things that I need to do, and not all of them, or most of them are probably not on a computer, but it's basically a way for me to reflect on what things need to be done and what moments I can use for those to do. I'm not as organized to also put a time estimation around it, but you could imagine that if you have a good sense of these are the things that I need to do, and I can break it into smaller pieces, and then I can start crossing off some of those things, that can be also useful.
Wonderful. Thanks, Shamsi. I think we're running out of time, but I'll try and make an executive call on picking a question that's most different from the others. Perhaps Zoltan, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I think my question is partially answered, but I'm trying to reformulate it to something else again. So you were talking on one hand about people taking breaks during work and then engaging them there a bit with microtasks, but you were also talking about de-engaging at the end of the workday and then re-engaging at the beginning of the workday. And then so these two coming together triggered me a bit to ask the question of, essentially, what do you think within the workday a break should be like? So should it be, let's say, longer, shorter? Should it be something where you don't totally de-engage from work tasks, but you do maybe some things like a microtask? Or should it be preferably something where you just totally don't think about work tasks at all and then come back to them, let's say, 15 minutes later?
I think that's actually a wonderful question. And I would say that our research around breaks has kind of like evolved, especially during the pandemic. So I think that, and this is going to be a non-answer because I'm going to say that it depends. I think that different people also react to breaks in a different way. So for some people, they just need to take a quick walk to be able to disengage from what they're doing. Some people need to quickly go and check out a website. They might need to go to social media to kind of like take a break. It also depends on what time you have available. If I only have 5 minutes, what is an optimal activity that I can do in that 5 minutes? Maybe I can just stretch, or maybe I can take a walk, and maybe I can go and talk to a colleague. So there are many things, but I think that one of the things that we are also seeing is super important now is that we do need to have some kind of breaks, not to overload that time between the different types of things that we are doing. Now, our days are filled with meetings. We are just basically moving from one meeting, hitting leave, and then hitting join again right away. And so what was naturally built into our day-to-day activities, where we were getting out of one meeting room, walking to the next one, which itself was a break, and then joining the next one. So we had this opportunity to actually ramp down from what we were engaged in and then ramping up to the next thing. And now we don't. So the reason why I say it depends is that as we're working from home, there is a bigger need to have like be very conscious about and very intentional about the breaks. And it's almost like sometimes you want to schedule time on your calendar to protect that. So maybe I need 15 minutes between because I really need to go and take a quick walk, or I need to get a cup of tea. We have also been looking at how we can put time for well-being even on a person's calendar. So for example, you schedule a 1 hour, you call it whatever you want to do. It could be a break. It could be that I want to go and exercise, but you want to have that time on your calendar so that it not only protects it from another meeting being scheduled, it also sends a signal to yourself is that, no, I really need to go out and I need to do something that is not work. And when it's on your calendar, what happens, and this is something that we did this summer, we saw some promising results, is that when you have it on your calendar, people tend to now work their productivity activities around that. If you don't have it on your calendar and you feel that, well, I need to kind of like go and take a break or do a run, and then people feel the need that, well, I took a break in the middle of the day, I need to now work extra to make up for that. I think it's something that is actually psychological, that, well, you have that time protected on the calendar, and then you are working around all your other activities to make sure it fills into the remaining slots, where if it's not as planned, then people feel that, well, I need to make up time for it. So again, I think that breaks are important, and they should be interleaved during the workday. They can be done in different fashions, and I think it depends on what an individual's needs are.
Thank you.
Excellent. I think that serves as a brilliant segue to towards the end of this, and perhaps all of us can reflect a little bit on how we'd like to detach from work before we bring in the holiday season. So once again, thanks a lot, Shamsi. It was a pleasure having you here.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak, and this was a really good conversation, as well as at the end. I wish we had a little more time. I think I went over, I went a little longer than I had originally intended to. But
no worries, I'm sure it was all
if you have
valuable.
questions, please send me emails, or we could have other conversations. I'm fine with that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. This is again the Academic Fringe Festival. This will be the last talk that we'll have this year within this edition, but do join us for several other exciting talks once we kick in the new year. So have a wonderful holiday season, everyone, and see you around very soon. Thanks again,
Happy
Shamsi.
holidays, everyone. Thank you.